So, hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Toxic Positivity, Burnout, and Collective Trauma. My name is Meghna Taneja, and I'm part of the Outreach and Education team at Montgomery Hospice and Prince George's Hospice. If you are new to our online programs, we welcome you. We've got a lot of people here today, and we're so happy to see you all. Or not see you all, but see your names in the chat. My role today is to just help facilitate and handle the behind the scenes logistics of the webinar. You might see me or my colleague Alejandro pop up in the chat box to address or help with any technical issues. I want to thank you for your patience ahead of time, should we have any. I'll also come back in at the end to discuss the program evaluation and CEUs. We do ask that you set aside other devices or work for the next hour, and for those who would like social work CEUs, full attendance is required. So to make this interactive, we might ask you some questions from time to time. We will be using the chat feature that I just mentioned to communicate with you throughout. You can access it by clicking on the messaging icon in your meeting controls. And when you send a message, if you want everyone to see it, please be sure to select all panelists and attendees for the box. Our webinar today will be moderated by Monica Escalante, the Chief Financial Officer and Chief Communications Officer at Montgomery Hospice and Prince George's Hospice. And we've invited 4 leaders to join us in discussing trauma, toxic positivity, and burnout. Monica has been working in end-of-life care since 2001 and has been at our organization for over 15 years. She's part of state and national hospice organizations and committees and has been involved in several conferences and presentations on hospice topics. She's also moderated our Building Workplace Wellness series. So Monica, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Meghna. It's a great pleasure to be with so many people from all over the state here today. In our audience, we have people from different hospitals, not only in the Montgomery County and Prince George's County areas, but all across the state. We have staff from the Department of Veteran Affairs. We have staff from the Sheriff's Office. We have numerous staff from many cancer centers all across the state. We have staff from nonprofit organizations that have been helping the communities that are hurting the most in the last year. We also have people from the Department of Aging and Community Services from different counties and from the state. We have staff from Housing Opportunities and a few staff members from the NIH. We also have staff from the University of Maryland, and we have one person that is from the University of Manchester. We also have independent practitioners and hospice clinicians. Our audience today is comprised by a wide variety of clinicians, including social workers, and we want to wish you a happy social work month. We also have nurses, nurse navigators, and we have top executives at hospitals and hospices in the audience today. So welcome everybody. We're delighted to have you. As Meghna said, we have about 240 people who signed up for this webinar. I want to make sure the webinar is being recorded because the recording will be shared with all of you in case you see that some other colleagues of you can benefit from the content we're sharing today. We encourage you to share the recording of this webinar as well. The panel is amazing. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Joanne Bachsho. She's a PhD and an LCPC and an award-winning professor of psychology and women's studies at Montgomery College. She's also an ASCECT certified sex therapist with a group practice in Maryland and the author of The Feminist Handbook, Practical Tools to Resist Sexism and Dismantle Patriarchy. She also writes the popular feminist blog, The Third Wave for Psychology Today. Before specializing as a sex and relationship therapist, Joanne was a trauma therapist working primarily with survivors of rape, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and adults who were abused as children. Joanne brings her nearly 2 decades of experience as a therapist to help clients transform their relationships and live happier and healthier lives. Thank you so much, Joanne, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Other panelist is Maud Harrison Hodson. Maud is an experienced grief counselor serving over 14 years with Montgomery Hospice and Prince George's Hospice. She's a Sunday morning chaplain, a podcaster, and a blogger. As a bereavement counselor, she works counseling grieving clients. She also develops and conducts workshops and support groups around grief and loss. She's currently facilitating virtual support groups. Thank you for being here today, Maud. You're unmuted. Our third panelist today is Elaine Kim. Elaine has worked as a bereavement counselor with Montgomery Hospice for 5 years. She's a licensed master of social work and has worked extensively with grieving adults of diverse backgrounds, both individually and in groups. She's also provided grief workshops and supportive events in a variety of settings across the Montgomery County. Thank you for being with us, Elaine.
I'm honored to be here.
Last but not least, Kip Ingram. Kip currently serves as Director of Bereavement Care with Montgomery Hospice, where he coordinates a staff of 8 professional grief counselors. He works regularly with many diverse communities, groups, and individuals around the issues of loss, grief, and coping. He has presented his work on grief and loss at area workshops for medical and mental health professionals and local religious groups, and has written several articles on the subject in hospice newsletters and other places. He's been published locally and nationally. Thank you for being with us, Kip.
Thank you, Monica. I'm glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. So we're gonna just dive into our topic today. And, oops, sorry, I am running too fast through the PowerPoint. So we're going to start with the objectives, because many people are going to be receiving continuing education credits today. We need to go through the objectives. And by the end of this webinar today, we hope that you'll be able to define burnout as an individual and collective level, as well as trauma, and evaluate its impact in the workplace. Describe the causes of burnout and individual as well as collective trauma. Identify the differences between burnout, stress, and mental illnesses. And finally, discuss organizational strategies to address burnout and the traumatic aftermath of COVID-19 at a personal and as a community. So I'm going to turn to our panel for the first topic today. We're going to talk about trauma. So what is trauma? Let's start with Joanne.
Sure. Hi. So trauma occurs when we experience overwhelming stress. And usually it's an event where we either believe that our life is being threatened or our loved ones' lives were being threatened. And so there's a wide variety of experiences that can be traumatic. And some of that really depends on, you and your own life experiences. But it is overwhelming. The traumatic event is a stressor, but what makes it traumatic is that your system is overwhelmed and you feel like you don't have the capacity to respond or even to survive, or your loved one. Yeah.
Yes, we wanted to begin today exactly as Joanne has begun us, kind of thinking about this simple image of trauma as a doorway into the larger points we want to make about collective trauma. And when you think about your everyday life, your typical our emotional continuity in our assumed world, we're always working every day, kind of regulating our stimulus threshold with the things that come into our environment or our world. We manage our emotional ups and downs, and a trauma is something that interrupts that continuity. It breaks it in a significant way so that it's hard for us to articulate, and our world that we had assumed kind of falls into question. And then when we can't articulate it, it then presses for recognition in the form of symptoms. And we're going to talk about symptoms in a later slide, but we wanted to start with this basic notion of trauma as a break, a significant, overwhelming break in our experience.
And our sense of safety, right? Yeah.
Right.
Very, physical, emotional, existential safety, all of it, every level.
Yeah.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and would I guess share the idea that we all act in this world. We plan and we identify what is safe or not safe based on the assumptions we have gained over our lifetimes. And what makes a trauma is often that those assumptions are shattered.
Mhm.
So the world that we thought was safe, we now think is no longer safe. Life which we thought was meaningful, events we thought were meaningful, now have no meaning. And my own idea of who I am and
Mhm.
my worth in the world is shattered, making it very difficult to try to function in the world again as I did.
Yes, and I guess I would think in terms of the one's emotional center being attacked. And some examples, of course, of that is, the past year of our lives being upended by pandemic. Personal traumas, a diagnosis, unexpected terminal diagnosis, a young child, I'm talking from personal experience now, a young daughter being hit by a car and killed. Those are all traumatic events that have a significant impact on one's overall well-being.
The image that you have on the slide is no accident. So there's a crack all across, and
Mhm.
can be repaired, but it would never be as it was before. So if we talk about societal trauma, and we have an image here with the individual trauma, the interpersonal trauma, and the collective trauma, and all the different factors that have been coming our way in the past. What is this image evoking in you? Kip, go ahead.
It can be overwhelming to just kind of read down through this list and think about the various impacts that communities have experienced over this past year. One of the things I want to say in regard to collective trauma is there is a growing body of statistics now of real measurable evidence that the impact that the pandemic is having across our country. This particular webinar is not just a few of us that got together with some anecdotes and now we're trying to make some grandiose claims about collective trauma. There's some real measurable things that are going on. And I would mention just very quickly, although I think Magna will put some of these links to these statistics in the chat. The National Center for Health Statistics recently came out with a study that they had done looking at levels of anxiety and depression, clinical levels. And what they discovered was in 2019, the clinical levels for anxiety in our country were at 8%. In 2020, that jumped to a staggering 36%. For depression in 2019, it was 6%, and that jumped to 28%. And when you think of it, that's respectively a third and a quarter of our population that are at or near these clinical levels. That's a real red flag indicator of the kind of traumatic elements that people are feeling and experiencing in so many different ways. There's also was a recent American Psychological Association study that came out earlier this month that pointed to higher levels of weight gain, higher levels of alcohol consumption. In fact, it was an alarming 52% of parents with school-aged children acknowledged that they are drinking more alcohol. So again, red flags there for the kinds of stressors that people are carrying. And of course, the research of Sherman Lee on the coronavirus anxiety scale and some of the things that he's doing that's looking at these very tangible, measurable effects that are going on.
Yeah, it's not one thing coming at us, it's the conjunction of so much. Maud?
So yes, when I think in terms or look at collective trauma, I think in terms of how some cultures, and I'll speak from the African American perspective, have carried trauma from past generations, historical traumas, and we carry those collective traumas in our bodies. And when a new event or circumstance occurs, it causes those feelings and emotions to surface, especially if they have not been healed from the previous wounds.
It's interesting what you're saying, Maud, because trauma triggers other traumas.
That is correct.
They pile up. Elaine?
Yes, I think what Maud is talking about is a really a huge one, especially with the African American community and the history that this country has. And there are so many layers of collective trauma in this country's history that we have not fully addressed. And I want to mention Pauline Boss, who first coined the phrase ambiguous loss in the 70s, acknowledging the kind of losses that have no resolution, and or that people largely refuse to address, and how our country has been founded in a lot of ways on some of these incredible social traumas, these collective traumas, including for African Americans and for Native Americans and immigrants who left their homes. There's a lot that we have never really grieved or acknowledged.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Joanne?
I had a couple of thoughts. One is that I wanted to just add to something that Maud said about intergenerational legacies of trauma. And we know from Holocaust studies that trauma creates epigenetic changes in our DNA. So it actually changes our body's chemistry. And then we pass that on through our further generations. Also, studies on African-American populations, which we know epigenetic changes from trauma affect motherhood mortality rates for Black women, right? So that is one thing that comes to mind. And also what I think about how normal trauma is in our society, that it is embedded in our culture, right? And so although we used to think of trauma as something extreme and unusual, it's really not.
Yeah, it's more common than we think it is.
Mm-hmm.
I love that point, Dr. Bagshaw, and I would just want to add that, often we are traumatized by events where we were already stressed.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot that is happening, that has happened in this last year have just opened our eyes to what was broken underneath. So
absolutely. Between COVID, racial uprisings, what wasn't working was exacerbated by COVID, and the inequities that already existed were just exposed now for more people to see. Yeah, and made worse.
True, but it sort of, what can we do about all of these? Now, I turn to the panel. So we have the individual trauma, the collective trauma, and all these different symptoms that many people might be experiencing now, like nightmares. Kip, you were talking about the consumption of alcohol going up. That's sort of, people are trying to, I don't know, palliate lack of sleep or nightmares or I don't know, other depression, disorientation. All of us are feeling so different. I don't think anybody is sheltered or is not experiencing what we're experiencing collectively right now. So what can we do about this? Elaine.
Oh, well, can I just add that the consequences of these collective traumas are not just what happens in our individual lives and families, but it happens to our whole system, our country, our bottom line, you know, financially as a nation, as we go into what is probably going to be a huge mental health and physical health crisis, you know, for our country and our society. So, you know, this is why we should all care. You know.
Everything is interconnected and we're seeing it, right? Nothing happens in isolation. Joanne?
Very true.
Mhm.
So I've been emphasizing to everyone that I know in this past year, because we're not through this trauma yet, right? That we really need to be focused on self-care, right? And stress management. And looking at the importance of our well-being. Are we taking care of our well-beings? But when we think about, you know, the effects of collective trauma, I want us to also think about what are we doing to support other people's well-being, our family members, our neighbors, our coworkers, our employees, everyone around us. You know, I do think one thing that trauma and even collective trauma does is gives us an opportunity to make changes, that this is potentially a culture changing moment. And as we know, the United States is a very individualistic country, and wouldn't it be great if we were more collective minded? And so this is an opportunity for us to really check in and think about the goal really being is well-being, and how are we doing that from a collective mindset? And if we can, and that can show up just in our everyday lives, and it can show up in the policies, you know, that and our politicians that we elect into office. So so I think that the solution really is focusing on well-being.
Yep. And Elaine said on the chat box that news, Facebook, Twitter have exacerbated trauma this past year. It's you know, an additional huge factor that worked against us. Kip?
Yeah, I think in this question you asked about kind of what helps, and I think it's an important discussion to have. Also think we're going to be asking this question for years, that this isn't the kind of thing that's going to be solved very quickly, because as all the panelists have acknowledged, these go very deep. I think the first step is acknowledging and locating the traumas that are happening. Just last week, we had the shooting in Georgia, and the kind of raised to the forefront the ongoing trauma that the Asian American community has experienced, and other kinds of things. Just being able to name what those are is hugely important. Yeah, and in terms of the chat comment, yeah, kind of the media, if we're not careful, can become this echo chamber, and we can kind of get drowned in that. So being wise, creating some distance from that when we need it, being able to listen to our sense of self about what we need and don't need in a given moment is hugely important. I think too, as part of kind of naming trauma, for one example would be the phrase and the work of Dr. Tashel Bordaire, who's at the University of Missouri, who's coined the term suffocated grief. And that's such a provocative image given George Floyd and the experience of murder and brutality that he and his family underwent. But this idea of suffocated grief, that people's grief is not only discounted, but they're punished for expressing and articulating that. For example, if you had let's say a 5th grade African-American boy who has seen this brutality on TV and is truly feeling the shock and the loss and the grief of that, does not feel like he's able to do his homework that night, goes to school the next day and is largely lethargic, and his teacher, who has no context for understanding that, punishes him by maybe sending him to the principal's office. And so not only has his grief been discounted, but he's now been punished for trying to come to terms and cope with that grief. And we see this too in people who are just wanting, for example, to express peaceful protest as an articulation of their grief and sense of loss and unfairness, who are being labeled, you know, as troublemakers or somehow doing something that's inappropriate. So being able, I think, is a first step to acknowledge and name the places in our society and our communities where trauma and loss is happening is important.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Educating ourselves. Go ahead, Maud.
I certainly agree with what Kip just said. You know, being able to give voice to the trauma, articulate what's going on, and having people to be open to listening. You know, oftentimes for women, African American women in particular, you know, you speak up and speak to a problem, you're referred to as an angry Black woman, because you're communicating what your needs are. And just as Dr. Bradshaw said, self-care. Self-care is very important. Knowing, you know, many people, I talk about my culture because I'm an African-American woman, so many people did not learn how to take care of themselves, and think it's a luxury. But in order to be able to function in society, we have to eat properly, get enough sleep, seek professional care, therapy, counseling, if needed, and have a network of people that you're able to talk to, exercise your body. Those are the kinds of things that we need in order to be able to just survive.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Maud. And we're going to talk more about these strategies for self-care in a few more minutes. We have this slide in front of us of toxic positivity, and I'm thinking about self-care, and I have to confess myself, I consider myself the glass is always half full, never half empty. And when I learned about the toxic positivity, I thought, wow, I have been doing this to myself for years, because in being so positive, I perhaps didn't make room to acknowledge and give the negative voice. So I want to turn to the panel to comment on this.
Well, certainly in the work that I do, as we do as grief counselors, you know, you hear people who are grieving saying that with their family and others, they have to kind of put on a face that they're all right and that they're okay, rather than acknowledging how they really feel. I think in the midst of the past year, in particular, with being in the midst of this pandemic, people have just been kind of acting as if, rather than acknowledging what's going on under the surface. And we live in a society too, where, you know, you put your best face on, tell people that you're fine, when in actuality you're not, because you think people don't want to hear it. So you have to find those people that you can share with how you're really doing, how you really feel.
Yeah. But also acknowledge that a lot of the things that we will have to deal with, or we have to deal now, don't have a quick fix. No. That's what Kip was saying. So it's going to take a long time.
Yeah.
Elaine?
I think Maud's point really sheds light on how we do this toxic positivity to ourselves, in addition to other people doing it to us. You know, so grievers judge themselves thinking they should be further along. You know, I don't want to be a downer. And then there are other people that literally tell them that, you know, aren't you over it yet? You know, like, think of your other kids, you know, you have so much to be grateful for, you know, and we know that what keeps trauma underground and unaddressed is the lack of space to acknowledge it. You know, the way that it's invalidated or denied, either intentionally or unconsciously. So it's wonderful that this is now like a new buzz phrase, you know, because it's an idea that's been around for a long time in different ways. And it's finally kind of catching on, which is hopeful, you know, like maybe we're evolving, and maybe this whole experience with all these collective traumas is going to help us to change how we treat each other and help each other. Just like Dr. Bagshaw was saying, I loved what she said, that, you know, self-care is not going to be enough. You know, we need to learn that we need to take care of each other. Like, that's the only way that we're going to be okay.
Mhm.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And on the chat, we have that sometimes studies have shown that our internal dialogue is often toxic, demeaning, and hurtful. Yeah, we have that voice inside us. Kip?
Yep.
Yes, toxic positivity, as Elaine said, we can kind of carry that as an internal judgment against ourselves as well, thinking that we have to feel certain things. And we should probably say with this slide that emotions aren't positive or negative, they just are. And we tend to label them as positive and negative. But toxic positivity is kind of an attempted cure, I think, that's going on in our society for a lot of feelings that are felt to be unbearable and hard to express, and a lot of fear around, you know, if we express them, what then? So there's this sense of we've got to cling to certain kinds of expressions with one another. And I think, you know, in the workplace, from managers and supervisors need to set a different tone. Elaine talked about this space and being able, you know, not all the time, because, you know, you have to get work done, but being able to have the space where you can check in with one another, have moments of kind of being honest and acknowledging that. Sometimes it can be done with a healthy form of humor. You know, on a scale of 1 to 10, today I'm a -5, or, you know, something like that. But I think if we're going to create healthy workplaces, that tone needs to be set of acceptance of those kinds of things rather than denying them or minimizing them or invalidating them.
True. Marlene here says that your actions are a form of microaggression. Sort of, if you are not on the positive side, you could be perceived as you're just negative. Yep. Joanne?
So in the therapeutic space, I see toxic positivity, much like what Kip described, as a defense mechanism to avoid feeling something more difficult. But the thing is, when we don't give ourselves the space to feel other emotions, those feelings don't go away. It's not like we just throw them out the window and they're gone. They still reside within us. You know, our feelings have to be expressed in some way. So if we're holding on to them and not expressing them, then they're going to come out in signs of stress, because this is, you know, in part what causes stress. So, you know, body aches and pains, weakened immune system, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to give our emotions some space to have, you know, to be felt, to have they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And with toxic positivity, we're not even giving them the beginning part, right? We're just holding them around, holding on to them. So, you know, back to the sort of idea that I like to talk about well-being. If you're not expressing or dealing with these harder emotions, you're increasing your stress and you're not taking care of yourself.
In what you're saying, it has physical consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Kip?
Yeah, and just to build on what Joanne had said a moment ago in terms of, you know, helping others within this challenge. Sometimes you may not have a choice. If you're working with someone who's been triggered with trauma, Robert Muller, who does trauma research and is a counselor, talks about the feeling of being de-skilled. You know, if they're triggered, all of a sudden, you've got to drop your agenda that you may have brought to that moment in that relationship. And it's all about where they're at in that moment. You may need to help them regulate. If they're feeling unregulated, that could take the form of just breathing with them, or a body scan, or a center of focus, or in the past with one person, because of the situation, we were able to just go for a walk. But part of helping another who's been triggered is creating that space of what they need, and they need to go at their pace. There's no rushing that. And that then leads into kind of longer terms of therapeutic strategies.
So what you're saying, Keith, is we in hospice, we have this saying, we meet people where they are. I think we need to practice that with ourselves as well, and with our colleagues, people we supervise, people we work with, that if they have been triggered, put everything aside and just meet that person where she needs to be met at that moment. Because I think it's an opportunity to heal. Am I using toxic
Yes.
positivity with
I think that's right, but we have to go carefully about rushing them. Sometimes when someone's had a trauma, often there needs to be some preparation work around building trust and some regulation exercises before being able to lean into that trauma. Sometimes I'll use the image working with someone of kind of working around a big hole. You know it's there, and at some point you'll look into it, but for now, let's do a few other things around good coping and some other things. So you have to go at a point when they feel ready to begin to lean into some of that trauma.
Okay. Joanne, did you want to say anything about this, leaning on someone who's been triggered?
Well, again, I just want to, be able to give people support and to have the feelings that they're having. Just, all we really have to do is listen and validate, right? We cannot make ourselves responsible for fixing other people, but we can create the space for people to just let them have their emotions.
May I add something to what Dr. Bagshaw just said?
Mm-hmm.
That we as a culture in America, and you were mentioning this before, have developed, with this idea that we can do whatever we put our mind to. We can fix what's broken, and there are winners and losers. There's good and there's bad, and that kind of mindset is what gets in the way of just allowing ourselves to be with all of the emotions, that we're experiencing, or that we see in front of us. So I think it's important to acknowledge that tendency that, if I show that I'm sad, I'm failing, or if I can't make her feel better, I'm failing, or that's bad. That's all stuff we as a culture need to start to let go of.
Yep.
I think education probably is the key, because many people don't understand what trauma is, don't allow people to speak about what's going on within. And so I think compassion and being open, having an open spirit and open heart, and the willingness to listen to others in the midst of taking care of yourself.
Right. And I want to not turn to then our next slide is burnout, but we have a lot of questions on the chat box, and I want to address some of them. Beth says, could you please discuss trauma-informed care?
Trauma.
That is a big topic. Part of this is the recognition that trauma and burnout and toxic positivity, we could spend a whole webinar on each one of those, going into greater depth. We're hoping to just show some links between these three in our presentation today. That's a really big topic.
Yeah.
I'll just say, trauma-informed care means that you are considering the role that trauma may play on whether it's a patient, a client, a student. in their challenges or difficulties, and considering that it's less about, what's wrong with this person, that they are suffering in this way, and more about what has happened to this person. And so it's a less pathologizing way to operate.
Yep. Another question is there a good assessment or way to assess an older adult's current feelings around their trauma?
Mm-mm.
Can panelists suggest a few trauma-informed methods for older adults?
Can you read the question again?
Is there a good assessment to assess an older adult's current feelings about their own trauma? Someone may not know this is a trauma they have experienced. They might just live like that and not know that this is something that has traumatized them in any way. I mean, especially with older adults, this trauma seems something new for many people. They're like, a trauma, me being traumatized. That's millennials talk about trauma.
I think
Yes, because
that,
go ahead.
sorry. Well, I was
Please
just
go
going to say, I think that coaching older adults to talk about what's going on the inside. I think that many of them grew up in an environment where you pushed it down, you kept it down, especially in the African American culture. You did not talk about what's going on in the family. It's personal. You don't want to put the bad laundry out there. So I think coaching and encouraging them to talk about what they're feeling and what's going on the inside. And sometimes that may require, getting some professional counseling.
Yeah. Joanne, did you want to say something else?
I don't need to add much to that. I was just, I don't think it's necessary to convince that person that they've experienced trauma, but maybe, kind of what Maud is saying is to have them express their feelings and see, how is the trauma affecting them today, and work from that, like, sort of bottom up approach, that you're helping them with their symptoms first, rather than going in cognitively and convincing them that well, this is a trauma, because then they may just become resistant and avoidant. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, burnout. What is burnout? I want to turn to Joanne because you gave the best explanation I've heard.
So burnout is chronic stress from being overworked and under-resourced. And we have traditionally thought of burnout, and research on burnout is traditionally focused in employment settings. But what we're also understanding now through COVID is how much burnout is playing at home with working mothers, and also in healthcare settings, or anyone working in a position as a caretaker.
Right.
Yep. Maud?
I was just agreeing with Glenn. For caregivers at home, many family members. I have a sister who is a caregiver for a husband, and she's definitely suffering from burnout, because there is no relief. She's in the midst of being a caregiver for a husband with Parkinson's, and isolated because of COVID, and completely burned out.
Yeah. And in the audience, we have a lot of clinicians. Who is not experiencing that? I don't know. It's way across every clinician, and everybody is probably exhausted right now.
Yeah.
I mean, burnout of being at home. Yeah. Elaine, do you want to add?
Just that it is very much coming to light how much more burnout has been an issue in this pandemic for women, and for women of color. who bear both, work stresses as well as primary, caretaking in the home, with little, sometimes few resources, and how stressful that can be. In addition to just the gender inequality in the workplace, and how women can feel, less heard, less seen, less valued in the workplace.
Yes, yes. And a lot of the times when I read about burnout, the flip side of burnout is strategies to take care of yourself, to set boundaries, to do better. But usually, most of the literature puts the onus on the person who's burnout to do something about it. And I want to pose the question to the panel, because there's this idea that the antidote to burnout is community, that we really should look at the systems we have in place and see how are they supporting or conducive to burnout, and how can we change them to eliminate that. Because you're talking about caregiving. It's really very hard to be a caregiver, a parent having children and having to take care of elderly parents is the impossible equation right now when you are also a teacher at home. So it's the system is just a setup for more burnout. So I want to turn with this question to Kip. Any thoughts on that?
Well, there's certainly not an easy answer to this, and there's no one antidote for everyone, I think. It's been talked about, this sense of trying to own that in some ways, that we become a little more intentional about some of the practices in our lives. I mean, for most of us in this particular webinar, mental health professionals, medical professionals, we've heard about burnout since we started education, and we hear about it regularly. We read articles on it. We've been encouraged about it. And sometimes I think in a managerial culture like ours, we assume that just knowing about something means we've integrated it and used it in our lives. And there's an ongoing challenge to think afresh about how we manage our burnout. It's like the old slogan, instead of thinking ourselves into new ways of living, maybe we need to live ourselves into new ways of thinking about this. We need fresh experiences of renewal and replenishment. And being intentional about that is going to be very important for all of us who are in the helping professions.
Yep.
Yeah, I think knowing when to ask for help, oftentimes when you're in that burnout place, you're thinking that you have to manage it all alone. So recognizing when you need to ask for help, know what you can control and what you cannot control, I think is important.
Right, but I find that many people would ask for help if they had emotional safety in the workplace. And that is not always the case.
Yeah.
You have to trust that you're not going to be judged for saying, this is all I can handle right now, given the circumstances. So I sort of see this as an opportunity. We have top leaders at hospitals and hospices. So I'm challenging the panel to come up with more ideas about this.
It's another pernicious form of toxic positivity. When people feel like, there's a wall or a culture of silence in the workplace, that if they speak up about these things, they'll be labeled as a complainer, or people will think they can't do the job. So again, there needs to be, from management, a tone that is set that is much different than that. I think, as just a employee, looking to check your perceptions about possible burnout with your supervisor or with a trusted colleague. A lot of HR resources in various companies are helpful. Developing your own strategies to deal with stress, and we'll talk about that some in later slides. But being able to kind of think intentionally, not about big steps, but about the small steps that can make a difference over time.
Yep. Elaine?
May I add? Yes, absolutely. And it's really important for leaders and organizations to understand the consequences of burnout for their organization. You know, look at what has happened in the healthcare field. You know, all the nurses and doctors that, you know, quit, resigned, or actually there were suicides, you know, due to the stress of the situation, which was caused not just by all the deaths, but the lack of support, you know, that the larger organization was providing, lack of training, lack of resources. And I don't think organizations can afford to lose their good staff, morale, interpersonal relationships between the staff. I think all of those things have a huge impact on the wellness of an organization, and to not recognize that is very short-sighted.
Yep. Yep. So I want to go back to, we have a comment from a participant. Marlene says, when we are in leadership positions, we can unknowingly pass our stress, feelings, trauma to our colleagues. These things can also impact decisions, mundane and critical ones. It's a really good point. Perhaps this includes the systems we have to prevent burnout or not prevent it.
I wanted to add something just to highlight that at the heart of burnout is the cynicism. And the cynicism comes into play because the caretaker is thinking to themselves, I'm doing all this caretaking. I'm taking care of other people's well-being. Who's taking care of my well-being? And that's what I want the leaders on this webinar to think about. How are you showing your employees that you care for their well-being? Because that's going to be the solution for you and your organization in solving and resolving burnout. And so, you know, that is going to, you'll have to probably survey your employees to find out what that means for them, because in each organization that could be something different. But at the heart of it, people who are caretakers need to know that they're being taken care of as well.
Yep. Yep. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Sure.
So our next slide is stress and depression. So a lot of times burnout could be confused with stress and depression. How are they different? How are they the same? What can we do about this?
Well, I'm happy to add, depression is usually pervasive in all areas of our life, and burnout is usually showing up in one or two places. Particularly with the cynical attitude that you may not, you know, have with your friends, but you have at work. But if you're depressed, you're that way in all contexts.
Oh, it's a very, very different. You can be happy and positive in some aspects, but then when you're faced with what's burning you out, you become cynical. That's a very good way to identify. So burnout is typically associated with work,
Right.
whereas depression is other areas in life, right?
And the low energy and the attitude and the negative thinking. I mean, when we think about depression, it's not just like being tired. It's you know, it's also your interpretations, the way that you're thinking about things. They do look alike, but there are these real nuanced differences to look out for. And, you know, the person with burnout is going to be saying, at my job, no one cares about us. But at home with their family may feel very differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we should probably acknowledge there are a lot of different kinds of depression.
Yes.
From you know, chronic to manic to seasonal. Probably situational depression is what I think I'm hearing our conversation talk about, that can feel and, you know, cross over with burnout in some ways. And given the kind of traumatic elements we've talked about, you know, it would make sense that there are higher rates of depression that are going on within our society.
And I think a part of depression too is feelings or anger that's turned within rather than expressing it outward. And I suspect that oftentimes people do not even are not aware that they are suffering from depression.
Yeah, the child psychologist Winnicott once talked about depression as the fog over the battlefield in war. In other words, there's a conflict that's felt to be unbearable. And so we throw up a smokescreen, we numb ourselves, and a kind of our fundamental aliveness is almost like a protective measure in relationship to that situational conflict. And it's not, I mean, that sounds very calculated and willful. It's not that calculated in our experience, but it is a kind of instinctive or unconscious reaction when we feel something unbearable, and we need to protect ourselves from that particular kind of dynamic.
So what are good ways to cope and heal from burnout? Now that we put depression aside, we just go back to burnout. What can we do about it?
Well, I would like to encourage people to express your emotions, right? Of course, I'm the therapist, so I'm going to say that. And, you know, that doesn't always mean therapy, but certainly moving your body, right? So getting those stress chemicals out of your body. And I think that's also extremely important during this time when we're still in this pandemic. And I don't know if anybody else has experienced this like me, but there, you know, unless I planned to get out of the house, there were days that I wouldn't get out of the house. So, you know, certainly moving your body, talking through your emotions with other people, and all the basics of self-care, which are getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, eating healthy meals, getting emotional support, meditating, you know, so ensuring that you are at least doing those things. And I think that if you are very stressed out, you have to consider that your level of stress management has to match or exceed the level of stress that you're experiencing. And I think that we're not very good at that. I think that we think I'm too stressed. I'm gonna skip a meal. You know, I got to stay up late and work. I don't have time to exercise, you know, and that's the opposite of what we need to be doing.
It's so hard. Go ahead, Mont.
I was just going to say, implementing positive, rational self-talk. Allow yourselves and give yourselves permission to step away from activities that's causing stress. Set realistic expectations for yourself, especially in the workplace. Know your strengths and limits and set boundaries.
Yes, yes. Elaine?
Sure, yeah, this is a wonderful list that is being compiled here and in the chat. But I guess, especially these days when there's so little that we have control over, the activities like crafts and, you know, even cooking, baking, doing things where you actually have control and have a beautiful finished product that you can feel good about, you know. So doing those hobbies or activities are important ways that we take care of ourselves.
Yes, yes. So I'm reading the chat box, and there's a question: what is the recourse to become less burnout when the system is designed to cater to burnout? That's I think we have to question our systems all across the board. And if there's one takeaway from the past year, is that we're in this together. When one of us is not well, all of us are not well. How can we rethink the systems and not cater to burnout anymore. And I like this question from Joyce, because it is, we're doing it to ourselves. We're not only doing it to others. If we could recognize that. So good ways to cope with and heal from burnout is naming it, and naming what I'm feeling right now and talking to someone I trust. And that's in sort of stress is not burnout. There's a question here. How is it different, stress and burnout?
Well, burnout is stress, yes. Sorry, go ahead, Elaine.
Oh, I was just going to say, at the very basic level, stress is our response. You know, it's a physical, mental, emotional response to a situation. And it could be a work situation, or it could be a personal situation. But it's very real. And if we don't address it, it can become a syndrome like burnout, or a mental illness like depression.
Yeah. Yeah. Joanne?
I just concur with what Elaine said so perfectly.
And we might also acknowledge stress isn't always bad, that there are positive kinds of stress. Athletes know this, or, something you're looking forward to, a new job or a baby, or, something like that. The stress that is a challenge is the stress that comes, as we've talked about, that can feel overwhelming, or that can feel persistent in relationship to our work, which then, yields to burnout.
Yep. And our participants are sharing some of their coping strategies. And someone says screaming or crying. I love that. The other one is a thankfulness journal, walking outside, being in the light, whether there's sunlight or artificial light, just go out. Turning the computer off at a certain time and giving myself that boundary. I think that's when I need to do more. Poetry. Crafts are a great way for the mind and the soul to assist in decompressing and the feelings and still allowing expression. I think art is, we don't do enough art, and we don't think ourselves as artists, and maybe all of us are an artist in the making. And we could find how we can be more artistic. Eating lunch, pausing in the middle of the day, dancing, listening to music, meditating, laughter, checking in on other people. And we also have, we have a long list. Help others, recharge, adjust expectations. And we are right now on top of the hour. We should be wrapping up our webinar. It's been wonderful conversation. Our last slide is our final path. And we have some thoughts for the audience there. Others have been sharing the chat box that are equally important. And I want to turn to the panel. First, very grateful for the discussion we had today. What would you like to say to the audience as we say goodbye today?
I would say that self-care is an ongoing process. So put yourself on your calendar, prioritize yourself, reassess your goals regularly in the workplace, and just celebrate your accomplishments, and know that you are important. And if you don't take good care of yourselves, you're not going to be able to take care of all these other things and people that you think you are charged to care for.
Yes, thank you, Maud.
So I would say I really appreciated the chance to think about these topics for myself, because I have been very aware of all of the traumas that have been going on, and yet I myself, in some ways, kept it at arm's length for a while. And it was recently with the incidents, you know, within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. I was, you know, again, I was thinking, I've heard it. I know this is going on. And it wasn't until people started asking me how I was feeling about it that I really started to unpack, you know, what was actually inside of me, that helped me to get in touch with that grief and my feelings, to actually put it into words, you know, to someone else. And I think it's really, it's shown me the power of, you know, reminded me of the power of doing that, and how important it is for each of us, especially leaders, to get in touch with their own losses, and the ways they've been affected and grieving, maybe that they're not even aware of. And that's the only way, you know, that they're going to be able to connect to their organization staff's, you know, issues as we all go through this.
Thank you, Elaine.
I'll just add or end by saying, see if you can use this as this situation as an opportunity to reorganize your life to prioritize your well-being.
Thank you, Joan. Kip?
Yeah, I would just second that and acknowledge there's a lot more to be said about all of these issues that we've raised. I hope this could be an ongoing kind of conversation in other formats, because it's an important one. It's a vital one that we're all kind of feeling and going through.
Yep. Sort of at the end of one road and at the beginning of a new one.
Yeah.
And we are all learning how to coexist and live in a better and healthier way. And we all play a key role on doing that. And I want to thank everyone in the panel and everyone in the audience. Being with all of you today has been a blessing to me. Turn it to Magna.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you to all of our panelists, Dr. Bagshaw, Maud, Kip, Elaine, for a topic that is not only relevant for all of our attendees, but for you all as panelists. Thank you for sharing your personal stories and how this has affected you. We want to thank everyone for joining in with us, for participating with us, sending in your questions and your messages. We really appreciate the interactivity, and it is difficult, you know, to do these trainings now solely online, but we really appreciate that chance to connect with you all and share this education for you.